Hi class, today we're going to talk about chapter 40, personal soundtracks, specifically Berlioz and the Program Symphony. But before we get further along in this topic, I just wanted to review some of the things that we've talked about so far with the Romantic period. So first, we started off with the German leader, specifically with Franz Schubert and Robert Schumann. And then we moved on to the American popular songs, specifically by Stephen Foster. And after that, we went back to Europe, focusing on the Romantic piano with Frédéric Chopin. And most recently, we ended with our discussion on female composers, specifically Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel and her output and style of music. So now we're dealing with programmatic music, and this was a main identifying theme in Romantic music. And program music is instrumental music with literary or pictorial associations. So the composer could indicate a title or have some sort of explanatory notes that are accompanying the music or are titling the music. And this could be specific characters or events or even a general mood. So imagine seeing a composition title like Early Morning Mist or something. It's very descriptive, and so the music would try to capture that image musically. Now, this also brought music closer to poetry and painting. Some people believe that programmatic music could express more emotions and things and feelings better than a writing or even a painting, a piece of art would do. Now, a lot of these works were related to moral or political issues. Here we have a painting that's based on Shakespeare's tragedy of King Lear, which this tragedy inspired not only composers in the Romantic era, but also painters, including William Dyce, who painted this King Lear and the Fool in the Storm. This next slide is the trombone multi-pavilions, which was one of the many new and unusual instruments created by the Belgian instrument maker Adolphe Sax, the inventor of the saxophone. Next, we have the checkering piano, which was made in Boston and was a focal point for entertainment in the 19th century homes. Now, the reason why I'm showing you these pictures of these instruments is a reminder of how the Industrial Revolution really changed a lot of people's lives, whether it's through work and earning an income or the accessibility of these instruments. So with the mass production of pianos, the costs went down and a lot more people could own a piano and be able to play music at home. The technological advances and the use of minerals and harvesting those minerals and creating alloys created different structures and brass, and so we start to see more instruments being created, like the saxophone, like the tuba, valved instruments. All these things were because of the Industrial Revolution. Next, we have a satirical engraving from 1846, and this was a picture showing listeners fleeing from Berlioz's bombastic orchestra. Now, if we take a look at this engraving, it just looks like chaos. People are covering their ears, instruments are all over the place, while Berlioz is conducting, calmly in the middle of that storm. So, of course it's a satire, so it's a bit exaggerated, but there is some truth to that. Hector Berlioz was creating sounds and textures and the use of different instruments that weren't, used before that time, and people weren't used to that. it literally felt like chaos. Now, during this Romantic era, we have two types of music: the programmatic music and absolute music. And the Romantics, they cultivated program music over absolute music. And absolute music is the pure music, music that does not have any literary or pictorial meanings. It's just music for music's sake. Now, our next composer is Hector Berlioz, and we're going to talk about his piece Symphonie Fantastique. Hector Berlioz was born 1803 and died 1869. He was a French composer and conductor, and he was the first great proponent of musical romanticism in France. Here we have a painting of Hector Berlioz. Now, originally, Hector Berlioz was in med school. He left med school to study music, and his big influencers were Beethoven and Shakespeare. So, like I said before in class, Beethoven was the bridge between classical and the Romantic era. And after he died, he shook up the whole world, and everything about the symphony music has changed ever since then. And Berlioz is one of the composers that came out after that. He was infatuated with this Shakespearean actress, Harriet Smithson. Remember I talked about that in class, how he was watching this English Shakespearean troupe perform. I can't remember what play it was, and he fell head over heels in love with her and had this obsession with her. And she, didn't really want anything to do with him. But he was just, he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. He was just the epitome of, love struck, love torn, all those emotions that, people feel, and, they just have to express it somehow. In 1830, he won the Prix de Rome and had the opportunity to study in Italy. Now, his musical style was intense, bold, and passionate. Remember, these are all characteristics of the Romantic era. He was a master of orchestration, and orchestration is the ability to, choose certain instruments or all instruments in different ways, to have them play at different times, to create different textures, to create different effects. And he, was the first person to really nail that down and create so much more. And people have studied his orchestration since then. Now, he was very daring and original and a very bold innovator, and he used large, huge orchestral forces. Now, before I talked about the different sizes of the orchestra compared to a Mozart orchestra, to a Berlioz orchestra, to a Tchaikovsky orchestra. Now, Hector Berlioz used more instruments, some of these new instruments like the tuba. In fact, usually in an orchestra, there would be one tuba, but for the Symphonie Fantastique, he uses two tubas. So imagine that, the low brass section is really robust. We have all these other auxiliary instruments, and it feels kind of like chaos. Now, his output with music, he had orchestral overtures, program symphonies. So the Symphonie Fantastique is a programmatic symphony. He wrote choral music, 3 operas, and he also wrote about writing about music. Here we have a painting of Berlioz's Idee fixe, which is inspired by the Shakespearean actress Harriet Smithson. Now, the Idee fixe is the fixed idea, or the main thing that kind of ties everything together. So this little motive represents her. And this is the first time, well, maybe not the first time. Beethoven does this a little bit in his 5th symphony, but we start to see more of this happening after he passes, and we see this in composers like Berlioz, where instead of each of the movements of the symphony having their own character, there is a unifying motive or theme that carries through all the movements to create a, a whole, a unifying whole. Here we have another painting. This is of the Witch's Sabbath, which is one of the movements in Symphonie Fantastique. This is by Francisco Goya, and this anticipated the passionate intensity of Berlioz's music. So taking a look at this painting, it looks spooky, supernatural, brooding, mysterious. These are all characteristics of romantic music. The obsession with supernaturalism, mysticism. On to the piece, Symphonie Fantastique. This is a 5-movement program symphony. The first movement is called Reveries or Passions. And, this is like love at first sight, the excitement. And movement 2 is a ball, literally like a masquerade type ball. Number 3 is Scene in the Fields. And number 4 is the March to the Scaffold. Remember I talked about this where the main character is being sent to his execution, and he's haunted by the memory of his love, who he believed that he poisoned accidentally, and right before he's about to be executed, there's the recall of his love with that idée fixe, and as if he sees her in the crowd, and then the guillotine cuts his head bounces with the pizzicato from the low strings, and then the crowd cheers, hooray, hooray, with those triumphant chords. And then the 5th movement, the Dream of a Witch's Sabbath. This is where we have all the spooky, mysterious, eerie, ethereal sounds. And the techniques that Berlioz uses for the strings are different than what we've heard before. There's a technique where they can take the bow and bounce it against the string as it's moving up the string. And it has, that sound that kind of makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Very creepy, but yeah, so like I said, he was a master of creating all these different techniques and sounds and orchestrating, choosing who's doing what when to create a certain effect. Now, the program, the background story for this symphony is by Berlioz, and it's autobiographical towards him. This is based on his infatuation of that Shakespearean actress Harriet Smithson. Now, he meets his beloved, and it's the ultimate demise of the artist. So in the Romantic era, he's fascinated with the grotesque and the supernatural, and we hear the Dies Irae quoted in the last movement. Now back to the idée fixe, or fixed idea. This is that recurrent theme, and it represents the composer's beloved, Smithson. And this is that unifying thread, literary and a musical significance, and the thematic transformation has varied appearances. So we hear it in its purest form in the beginning, and throughout the movements of this symphony, it has been transformed. Now with movement 4, March to the Scaffold, the main character is in an opium-induced dream. Now the artist dreams that he has killed the beloved, and he witnesses his own execution. Now we have instruments in unusual ranges, so we have really low sounds to really high sounds, and we have sudden dynamic changes. So with movement 5, the Witch's Sabbath, the Witch's Sabbath is a gathering for his funeral, and the beloved comes into the infernal orgy. Now the Dies Irae, which is quoted meaning the day of wrath, is from the ancient Mass for the dead. So we'll listen to that in a little bit. Now, for listening guide 32, we're going to be talking about movement 4 and movement 5 from the Symphonie Fantastique. Now, this piece was created in 1830, and with the March to the Scaffold, we have an allegretto non troppo, and this has a sonata-like form with 2 march themes. Now, theme A has a downward minor scale, and theme B has a diabolical march tune with more of the brass and woodwinds. And the Idée fixe is at the end, played by the clarinet, and it's like the last thought of love. Now we have a sudden fortissimo chord. So remember, fortissimo, we have 2 Fs. The second F, we're using the word very, so very, very loud. And it's a fall of the blade. So the blade meaning the guillotine. And at the end, we have the loud, triumphant chords, like the crowd is cheering. Now, in our second movement here, movement 5, the Dream of a Witch's Sabbath, we have a larghetto and then allegro assai as our tempos. So we start slow and eerie. We have muted strings. So instead of letting the string vibrate naturally, they put a mute that kind of dampens the sound. And it's as if I don't know if you guys have ever been in like a sound booth or recording booth, but you know, the air feels different. It feels like everything's being sucked in, and the sound does not have the ability to bounce everywhere. Like we bounce off walls, the desk, the chair. It feels like it's being sucked in, like you're. So when you have a mute, it has a different sound. I mean, the notes are still there, but instead of having that vibrance when it rings out naturally, it's just not muffled, but just dampened. Like the sound kind of is swallowed in on itself. So we have muted strings, we have chromatic scales, and then we have the allegro, Idée fixe as a vulgar tune and a high clarinet. We have trills and grace notes. And then we have dissonant chromatic harmonies. And we have the dies irae, which is quoted first slow and then twice as fast. Don, 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 don. Then we have the Dance of the Witches, which builds into a fugal setting. So remember, with fugues, we have a statement and an answer, and a statement, answer, and they're happening at different intervals, starting, on the tonic, and then starting on the answer is on the dominant, so starting on the 1 and the 5, and each time they're coming in different voices. Now, after this, we have the dance and the dies irae combined together to build to a final cadence. Now, one of the really cool things that Berlioz does is he has 2 statements, of the themes, and then at the end, he has both those themes play at the same time. So like a reunion of the 2 themes. Sometimes we see that in like music mashups and things line up properly where you have 2 different songs playing at the same time or singing at the same time. Berlioz does that really well with the orchestra. And here we have the breakdown for Listening Guide 32. One of the things that I'm seeing on here, of something to make note of, is the prominent timpani for the timbre, and instruments in unusual ranges. So you might have like a really high bassoon part or a really high tuba part, and it has a different sound than what we're used to versus a low sound. And like in the beginning of the March to the Scaffold, we start really soft and quiet, and it builds and builds and builds until you get to, the scaffold, where the execution is about to happen. Okay, so let's take a listen to March of the Scaffold. This is theme 1 or theme A. Here's a tuba up really high. Now we're in theme B. The EDA fix. The cheering crowd. All right, next we're going to listen to the fifth movement, The Dream of a Witch's Sabbath. So far, we're hearing all these eerie, spooky sounds. Whether it's the trombones with the tuba, like, laughing, the ghouls laughing. And then we start to hear the high clarinets with that weeping sound. Think of a witch's cackling. Grace notes and trills. Can you hear the EDA fix in there? Bells chiming, church bells. Far away. This is the Dies Irae, the bassoons and tubas. Twice as fast now on the brass. So here with this part of the Dies Irae, we hear that medieval like chant, and then in the low strings we're hearing this grotesque rumbling, yump, 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 as it's building and building. We have that dance music that's kind of being interrupted by the brass. Now we have that dance theme in the fugue setting. A huge dynamic contrast here. Can you hear it slowly building and building? As we're getting higher and then back low and higher and higher. The dance theme is back. Now with the Dies Irae. This is where they're bouncing the bows on the strings. Those trills. So awesome. I love that piece. All right, that's it for chapter 41. Now we're going to move on to chapter 42.